In this series of videos, we're going to talk about another kind of event that we can deal with in our GUI programs, and that, or another class of events, and that is mouse events. So these are going to be events related to the moving, clicking, otherwise interacting with the user's mouse. Now these are going to essentially follow the same procedure that we've been talking about all along. The user interacts with an event source, an event object is generated, and then your event listener reacts to that event object and take some sort of action. One of the big differences with mouse events is that unlike the other components we've looked at, there's no visual source. So there's no button to click, right? There's no text field to type into. It's sort of an invisible source, the user's movement of the mouse. So that's the big difference is the event source isn't a visible source, but other than that, the general procedure for dealing with mouse actions is still the same. So when an action happens with the mouse, an event object is generated, just like with all other types of GUI actions. When the mouse is clicked, when the mouse is moved, when the mouse is dragged, and there's other types of actions we can take with the mouse as well, and that event object is generated. And just like other event objects, that mouse event, so the class that we use for this kind of event object is mouse event, and that object has methods that allow you to retrieve the information stored inside that event object. So there's lots of methods, but a few of them that are pretty useful are get point. What this one does, it allows you to retrieve the point, the XY coordinates of where the mouse was when this action happened. So that allows you to tell exactly where the user's mouse was located when they clicked it or moved it or so on. Another method is get the click count. So let's say if you wanted to know if the user double clicked or single clicked or triple clicked the mouse, you could get the click count, and maybe you're taking a different action based on whether the user single clicked or double clicked. And again, there's more methods that you can invoke on a mouse event, but get point's probably the most useful, and then there are others. So for your listener classes, there's actually two different listener interfaces that you might use. One is called Mouse Listener, and one is called Motion Listener. Now this is something that's also a little bit different from the listener interfaces we've seen before because there's more than just one method that we need to implement. So for Mouse Listener, there's actually five methods, and they're listed here. They're related to, or they represent rather, the actions of a mouse being pressed, the mouse button being released, or the mouse being clicked. So a mouse being clicked is essentially the action of pressing and releasing without moving in between. So typically if we want to know if the user clicked somewhere, we use mouse clicked. But there might be an instance where you actually want to know when the user presses down and then when they release. That's sort of like the two intermediates, the two stages of a click. But typically it's mouse clicked that we want to use. Then there's also mouse entered and mouse exited, which will tell you if the mouse pointer is is moved on top of or off of a particular component. So if you want to know if it enters a certain region of your program, something like that. So these are the five methods that are in the mouse listener interface. But then there's also a mouse motion listener interface that has two methods in it, mouse moved and mouse dragged. So mouse moved is just what it sounds like. Whenever the user moves their mouse, an event object is generated. So you can think about, if you can see my cursor, I'm moving it, moving it, moving it. There were a ton of events generated in that little span of time. Mouse dragged represents events for when the mouse is moved while the button is pressed down. So here if I click and drag, in this case I'm drawing a red line, every time I'm moving in that dragging process, the mouse dragged method would be invoked. Okay, so you have to think about what kind of mouse actions you want to listen for. Typically the most common ones are going to be clicked, moved, and dragged. Those are going to be the most common ones that you'll listen for, but there are other events you can listen for as well. And notice that all of these methods take a mouse event object as the parameter, and it's the same type for both mouse listener and mouse motion listener. They both take parameter of type mouse event. So in order to register the listener, it's a little bit different, right? Because we don't have a button to register a listener to, right? We don't have a text field, we don't have a radio button, and so on. So instead what we do is we actually register the listener to the panel itself, to the component. Now you can register listeners to other containers or other components in your program, but they can be a little bit funky with how they work. So, for example, frames just don't necessarily play well with mouse listeners. So, I recommend always registering the listener to your panel, but keep in mind that you might have to register two listeners. So, if you're listening for these first 5 types of actions, namely if you're listening for mouse clicks, you need to add a mouse listener. And if you're listening to these last 2 kinds of actions, movement or dragging, you need to add a mouse motion listener. So you're going to need to invoke either the add mouse listener or add mouse motion listener, or perhaps both. Now, this is kind of an easy place to make a mistake, is to add the wrong listener to your panel, and then the program won't work because it won't be listening for the kind of events you want to listen for, but it'll look like everything's working properly. So this is a really easy mistake to make, so be really careful about this. You want to make sure you're adding the right listener depending on which kind of action you want to account for. And again, we're adding that to our JPanel object. So in most cases, that's going to happen in the constructor. So we'll add it to our invoking object this, which means the current object to the current panel. That won't always be the case, right? You could add it to a named panel like main panel.add mouse listener or something like that. But frequently you'll just add it to the current object. Now, with our 2 listener interfaces, we have to include all of those methods, even if, which is usually the case, we only want 1 or 2 methods. So if all we care about is listening for mouse clicks, we still have to implement all 5 methods, right? That's the rules for interfaces. But there is another thing we can do, and that is that instead of having our listener class implement mouse listener, we can have it extend mouse adapter. An adapter class is just a class that implements an interface and gives sort of shell methods or empty methods to all of the methods in that interface. So then you choose to extend that adapter class and only override the ones that you want. So if all we cared about is the mouse being clicked and the mouse being moved, we could have our listener class extend mouse adapter and then only implement those 2 methods instead of, in this case, having to implement all 7 methods of both interfaces. So this is typically what I'll do in my examples. You don't have to do this. You can have your listener class implement mouse listener or mouse motion listener, but I'm going to recommend you do this because it allows you to only write the methods that you really need. Now, it is really important when you're doing this to include the @override annotation because this allows you this puts a compile time check on the method header being correct. Because you're extending mouse adapter, this is really, really important to use. Okay, so that's a little bit off topic for this current lecture video, but just keep in mind that if you're extending mouse adapter, use that override annotation to put a compile time check on your method headers. So let's take a look at this in action. We're going to start by writing a GUI that counts the number of clicks inside of a panel, and we'll print the number of clicks and the coordinate of each click as we go along. So because we're going to be drawing something, we're going to be drawing the points that are clicked and the coordinate of those points. I'm going to start with the GUI drawing template. I'm going to create a new class, click count GUI. I'll call it mouse click count GUI. And I'm going to pause the video for a moment while I go ahead and fill in all of the question mark places to get this to compile. Okay, so my program now compiles. Of course, as usual, doesn't do anything. It just opens up. I'm using a white background. I set my title. That's about it. So what I need to do is I need to keep track of everywhere that the user clicked on a point, because then I'm going to display that point on the screen. So a couple things I need to think about is keeping track of points. Well, we know that a good way to keep track of things is either with arrays or array lists. But of course, in this example, I don't know in advance how many times the user is going to click. So I probably want to use an array list since I don't know the maximum capacity to make my array. So I'm going to use an array list. And what kind of object is my array list going to hold? Well, I want to keep track of all of the points that a user has clicked, so all the locations where the mouse was when they clicked, because then I can use that point to draw something at that point, namely a circle and the coordinates. So my array list is actually going to keep track of point objects. So I'm going to hold a bunch of points in this list. I'll just call this my point list. import array list class. My Eclipse is a little slow today. Okay. Then I need to initialize that list in my constructor. So my point list gets a new array list that holds point objects. So now that I can keep track of all, and I'm going to write the code to do this in a minute, but I have a way to keep track of all the points. I'll need to do two things. I'll need to fill that list up, right? Anytime the user clicks, I need to add a point to the list. And then I also need to go through that list and display it. So the keeping track of the points is going to happen in a listener class, right? Because that involves interacting with the user. I need to know when the user clicks something, and I'm going to grab that point and put it in my list. Then the display of those points is going to happen inside my paint component method. Remember that the paint component method is a method we use to update any visual display on the screen, to draw anything. In this case, we're drawing just the point itself as well as the coordinates. Okay, so I'm going to start with the listener part. So I'm going to go over to my regular GUI template, and I'm going to borrow that handler code template. Put that here. So I'm going to call this my click listener. And instead of having it implement action listener, this is the very important part, I'm going to have it extend or extends mouse adapter. So this is the first time that we're really using a different listener interface, or in this case class, other than action listener, and this is the syntax for it. So private class click listener extends mouse adapter. Okay, so now because I'm using this extends mouse adapter, I can decide to only override that one method that I care about, which in my case is mouse clicked. So I only care about listening for mouses being clicked. I don't care about the mouse moving or being dragged. I don't care about any of that. So if I don't care about those kinds of actions, I don't really want to include them inside my program. Now, if I didn't do this way, if I had said implements mouse listener, which of course I can do, that's allowed, but now I'll need to add those 4 other methods and just leave them empty. Okay, so you can do that. It's perfectly fine, and you'll see that in lots of other code, but it's just a little bit unnecessary, right? We don't need those other methods. We don't care about those kinds of events, so I'm going to choose not to implement them. And the way I do that is by saying I will extend the mouse adapter class. Now, one last note, as I mentioned, it's really important to use this override annotation, and that's because if I don't use that, and let's say I misspell the name of my method, the compiler is not going to catch that. Okay, it's just going to think that this is some other method that's in my listener class, and the program's not going to work. And again, this is going to be really hard to track down. So make sure you're always using that override annotation, because look, now I have a compiler error saying, hey, something's wrong with this method header. So it's really important to use that when you're extending mouse adapter. Okay, so getting back to what we're actually doing with our listener class, we're listening for the mouse being clicked. And when the mouse is clicked, what we need to do is we need to find out where the mouse was when that happened, because that's the point we're going to add to our list. So we can use that getPoint method, event.getPoint, that says, hey, go to this event object and give me some information about the event, in this case, the point where the mouse was when that event happened. And then we'll just add that point to our list. And that's pretty much all we need to do for that part of the method right now. So now I can go up to Paint Component, and I can say, okay, anytime I want to update the display, I need to go through the list. So I need to say for every point in my point list, and I'll use a for each loop for this, I'm going to draw an oval. I'll fill an oval at the x and y, so point.getx, point.getY, and I'll make it 10 by 10. I should probably make that a constant. And of course, these takes integers, so I'm actually going to make a local variable because point.getx returns a double, and the fill oval method requires an integer. So I need to cast it from a double to an int. Okay, so that draws a little oval at that point, and then I'll also draw a string. I'm going to draw the coordinates in parentheses, and I will draw those at the X and Y location. Okay, so if I run my program right now, start clicking, nothing is happening. I'm missing two important steps. So pause the video for a minute and see if you can think about what I am missing in this program, why nothing is working. So the first thing is I haven't registered this listener to anything. I've said that what this listener does when a mouse gets clicked, but I haven't registered it to any source. So that's my first big thing that's missing. So I need to say this dot add mouse listener, a new click listener. And I'm using add mouse listener interface because I'm listening for clicks, not for motion or dragging. Now if I run this, still nothing happening. So I'm still missing something. Notice if I resize my window, oh, there are my points. So of course what I'm missing is that call to repaint. So every time we add a new point to the list, we want to update the display. The way that we update the display is by calling repaint. Okay, so now when I run, there we go. I'm drawing a point as well as the coordinates at every time the user clicks. Now, just to show you what can happen, if I had accidentally added mouse motion listener instead of mouse listener, everything compiles, runs just fine, but the program doesn't work. And that is a very frustrating error to try to track down. So again, be really careful that you're adding the correct listener to your panel. So the last thing we're going to do is we had also wanted this program to display the number of clicks. So we're going to add that. We'll add a label. Call it count label. Say clicks 0 so far. And I'll set the font. Make it a little bit bigger. And of course, we'll add it to our current panel. Okay, so let's see what that looks like before we worry about updating it. So there we go, clicks. Of course, it's not being updated when I click anywhere. In order to update it, I need also, of course, an integer. I'll call it click count. I will initialize it 0. And then anytime in my listener class when the user clicks, I want to update the click count. And then of course I also need to update the text of the label. So my click label, I will set the text to be clicks. It said, plus the click count. What did I call it? Count label, not click label. Okay, so now here we go. There we go. We keep track of the count and also the individual place. So there's your first example of using mouse actions. In this case in particular, we're using mouse clicks.